So we have this event here at PBC on Super Bowl Sundays where we have everyone bring in a big crock of soup or some other stuff, and we have soup and ice cream sundaes, and it's a lot of fun and everything. Imagine, if you will, that this year everyone forgets to bring their stuff. I mean, nobody brings a crock of soup, nobody brings any ice cream, nobody brings any bread or anything else. Everyone forgets. And so Pastor Joel has just, done his announcements, and he said, hey, don't forget, today is Soup and Sunday. Stay afterwards. It's going to be a really great time. And then around the auditorium, there's just gasps as, oh, I forgot the soup. Right? There's whispers, like, oh my God, I forgot did you get that? No, I didn't bring, oh man. It's awkward. It's crazy. And then all of a sudden, one person speaks up and says, hey, I overheard what the rest of you were saying about not having it and everything, but I've got a can of soup in my car. I'm not sure that'll help any, but I do. I saw it just this morning. I've got a can of soup in the back of my car. There's a mom a few seats over, and she's rummaging through her purse, and then she speaks up and says, hey, I just found a package of 2 saltines here in my purse. And then somebody else adds, well, hey, I think down in the freezer downstairs in the kitchen, there was one of those little ice cream cups left from a youth event. Can you imagine if our director of hospitality, Carrie, stands up and says, you know what, I think I can make this work. I think that'll do it. I think a can of soup, and if you'll give those 2 saltines, ma'am, and yeah, I think you're right. There is that little tiny tub of ice cream down there in the freezer. I think this will work. Everybody go ahead and plan to stay. It'll be great. We've got this. If that works, if we can feed the 100+ people here using a can of soup and 2 saltines and a little tiny thing of ice cream, oh my goodness, we would not forget that, would we? I mean, next year, when it comes time for the thing, people will be talking about like, oh man, do you remember last year when? Right? We would not forget that. And that sounds strangely familiar to the story that we're going to look at today. I'm in Mark chapter 6. This is verse 30. The apostles gathered around Jesus and reported to him all that they had done and taught. And he said to them, come away by yourselves to a remote place and rest for a while. For many people were coming and going, and they didn't even have time to eat. Verse 32, so they went away in the boat by themselves to a remote place. But many saw them leaving and recognized them, and they ran on foot from all the towns and arrived ahead of them. When he went ashore, he saw a large crowd and had compassion on them because they were like sheep without a shepherd. Then he began to teach them many things. When it grew late, his disciples approached him and said, this place is deserted and it's already late. Send them away so they can go into the surrounding countryside and villages to buy themselves something to eat. You give them something to eat, he responded. They said to him, should we go and buy 200 denarii worth of bread and give them something to eat? He asked them, how many loaves do you have? Go and see. And when they found out, they said, 5 and 2 fish. Then he instructed them to have all the people sit down in groups on the green grass. So they sat down in groups of hundreds and 50s. And he took the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, and looking up to heaven, he blessed and broke the loaves, and he kept giving them to his disciples to set before the people. He also divided the 2 fish among them all. Everyone ate and was satisfied. They picked up 12 baskets full of pieces of bread and fish. Now those who had eaten the loaves were about 5,000 men. Well, I bet they'll remember that, right? 5,000 men, who knows how many women and children, big crowd, fed them all, 5 little loaves of bread and 2 little fish. It'd be like me walking in, with a little package of bread and a thing of beef jerky. And hey, let's go, let's feed everybody. Well, let's see what happens next. Verse 45. Immediately, he made his disciples get into the boat and go ahead of him to the other side, to Bethsaida, while he dismissed the crowd. And after he said goodbye to them, he went away to the mountain to pray. Well into the night, the boat was in the middle of the sea, and he was alone on the land. He saw them straining at the oars because the wind was against them. And very early in the morning, he came toward them walking on the sea and wanted to pass them by. When they saw him walking on the sea, they thought it was a ghost, and they cried out because they saw him and were terrified. Immediately he spoke with them and said, "Have courage, it is I, don't be afraid." Then he got into the boat with them, and the wind ceased. They were completely astounded because they had not understood about the loaves. Instead, their hearts were hardened. The disciples were completely amazed at what happened. They were astounded. They were shocked. And that's not a good thing in this case. By this time, they should at least not be surprised by this demonstration of Jesus' power. But they viewed this circumstance, the one that they were in that moment, out on the sea, rowing in a storm, they viewed that as being somehow different from what they'd seen Jesus do in the past. But this is worse than a failure to connect the dots. See, they failed to understand the lesson of the loaves. That's what this says. Their hearts were hardened. They didn't remember the lesson of the loaves. What was the lesson of the loaves? That Jesus is the Son of God, and therefore he's the Lord of creation. And if he's the Lord of creation, he's the Lord of everything created. And that is everything. So Jesus can create food, right? Jesus can walk on the water, and Jesus can calm the storm. He can control the weather. He is the Son of God and Lord of creation. And they had failed to understand that lesson. They had failed to appropriate what they'd seen him do in their presence to their current circumstances. But like I said, it's worse than a failure to connect the dots. Their hearts were hardened. They had closed their mind, and therefore they were unable to perceive the truth. They had closed their mind to the evidence of what they'd seen Jesus do. They had hardened their hearts and didn't realize that that's what had happened. But now they were unable to perceive the truth. They didn't see. They didn't pass this test. They didn't understand. It's possible for insiders, people to whom Jesus has revealed his identity and his authority, to begin to believe and act like outsiders. People who've never believed, right? It's possible for that to happen. It happened to them. It can happen to us. Faith in God is vital for us, but it's not natural for the old nature. In fact, we talked about this earlier in this series, how the old nature is actually always looking for a reason to not believe. Hardening of the heart can happen to anyone. It happened to them. It can happen to us. So what do we need to do? How can we protect against that? Well, the first is to learn the lesson of the loaves. One author put it this way: Jesus could feed 20,000 people. He had previously calmed the sea. Could he not protect them in this situation too? Yeah, if they'd learned the lesson of the loaves, they would have come to that conclusion. If we would learn some of the lessons that we face, we'd come to that conclusion too, right? But we don't. As D.L. Akins was saying, we say, yes, God, I know you can, and that you have done this and you've done that, but my situation is different. I know you can do the impossible, but my situation is beyond impossible. So what is your lesson of the loaves? We talked about it was for them, the lesson of the loaves for them was that Jesus is the Son of God and therefore Lord of creation. What is your lesson of the loaves? What was the lesson about Jesus that you could and should learn from what God recently did in your presence? What is that lesson from what Jesus has done in the past that would apply to your current situation, your present? I've been thinking about that this week. For me, I think my lesson of the loaves is this, that things don't have to turn out okay for me to be okay. As many of you know, back in August of 2021, I got taken out by a dog while I was riding a bike, and it didn't go very well, and I had some brain trauma and 6 broken ribs and a broken collarbone and some other things, lots of bruises and stuff like that. And I remember being there in the hospital, and my mind was just starting to work mostly again. It hadn't completely. But one of the things I remember was I was surprised by the fact that, even though things were not turning out okay, I was in a lot of pain. and I couldn't move, and this didn't work, and that didn't work, and there were bruises all over, and I wasn't completely sure about how much of my brain I was going to function, I was going to get back. I was a little surprised that I was doing okay on the inside. I was at peace on the inside. And because things on the outside definitely were not turning out okay. They were not going according to my plans. They were not going favorably. Yeah, sure, I was a little bit grumpy, because I remember thinking that, hey, I was doing the right thing. I was outside exercising, trying to take care of my body and trying to de-stress and care for my emotions, my mind. I remember being frustrated, like I'm doing the right thing, and so this shouldn't happen to me. Good things shouldn't happen when you're doing the right thing. And yet somehow that wasn't the strongest thought. In my mind, there was this peace that I couldn't explain. And I remember thinking, oh my goodness, maybe things don't have to turn out okay. In other words, go according to plan or turn out in a favorable way in order for me to be okay, at peace, and safe in God's hand. I'm kind of ashamed to tell you that because that's a lesson I should have learned long, long, long ago. But that's what God was teaching me in those moments of August and early September. It's the lesson that He's trying to get me to remember right now. As I wrote this message to give to you this week, I made a short list of things that are not going favorably for me right now, things that I'm praying to God about and saying, God, would you please resolve this? Would you please fix this? And there were at least 5 pretty good-sized things on that list right now, things that are not going okay. They're not going according to the plan, and if nothing changes, it's not going to turn out in a good way. And what God wanted me to do is pause and say, yeah, that's true. Yeah, Andy, you're praying about these 5 situations that need God's intervention. Yeah, that's true. That is true, but that's not the whole truth. Remember the lesson of the loaves? Remember what I taught you back in August and September? The things don't have to turn out okay in order for you to be okay. Things don't have to go okay for you to be at peace, for you to be safe in God's hands. That's my lesson of the loaves. What is your lesson of the loaves? I hope you'll think about that over the next few minutes or over the next few days. I could ask it another way. What has God already taken you through that will help you trust Jesus with what you're currently going through? What has God already taken you through that will help you trust Jesus with what you're currently going through? What is your lesson of the loaves? Well, let's jump back into the text, but we're going to go forward to Mark chapter 8. In those days, there was again a large crowd, and they had nothing to eat. And He called the disciples and said to them, I have compassion on the crowd because they've already stayed with me 3 days and have nothing to eat. If I send them home hungry, they'll collapse on the way, and some of them will have come a long distance. His disciples answered Him, where can anyone get enough bread here in this desolate place to feed these people? Verse 5, how many loaves do you have? He asked them. Now, you may be thinking, wait, this is deja vu here, right? Isn't this like same song, second verse kind of thing? Like, didn't they just do this? Yes, yes, and yes. And yet, they seem to have forgotten. And Jesus is going to teach the same lesson a second time. Well, that's never happened for any of us, has it? God's never had to take us through something similar and teach us the same lesson twice. No, not me, not you, I'm sure. But these guys, yeah, that's where they were. Well, in verses 6 to 9, we learned that Jesus miraculously fed 4,000 people that day using 7 loaves of bread and a few small fish. And then after the meal, the disciples collected 7 large baskets of leftovers. In verses 11 and 12, the text continues where Jesus is now interacting with the Pharisees. And they demanded proof that He was from God. And they said, without proof, they would not believe. You could just look at him and say, well, what about the meal that you just had, right? But they would not believe. Why? Because they had closed minds. They had hard hearts. They had closed their minds to the evidence that was clearly there about who Jesus was and the authority that Jesus had and what that authority extended to. They had closed their minds. They had ignored the evidence. They had hard hearts and would not believe any of the proof that He offered. I want to stress, doubts and questions are okay. Hardness of heart is not okay. If you've got questions, you're like wondering, can this all be true? And what about Jesus and this? And can I trust the Bible? And if God is good, then why does he allow suffering? Doubts and questions are okay. And I invite you to look into that. There are good answers to most of those things. And anything that you can't find a good answer to, I believe that God will help you work through that in an intellectually satisfactory way as well. Doubts and questions are okay for those who want to believe. Hardness of heart is a whole different issue, because hardness of heart is when we close our minds to the evidence that is there, and maybe we don't want to believe. We're listening to the old nature. Well, Mark 8, verse 13, the story continues. Then he left the Pharisees, got back into the boat, and went to the other side. The disciples had forgotten to take bread and had only one loaf with them in the boat. Then he gave them strict orders. Stop right there. Can you imagine what these strict orders are? If it had been me, since I can't multiply bread or anything like that, if it had been me, I'd probably be like, guys, next time we have one of these big meals and there are several baskets of leftovers, bring them, right? But that's not what he says. Back to the text, verse 15. Then he gave them strict orders. Watch out. Beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and of the leaven of Herod. Beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the leaven of Herod. Now, leaven is like yeast. They put it in bread and it helps the dough to rise. Leaven in the Bible is a symbol for permeating power. A little bit of something that you put in there and it spreads and it affects absolutely everything, the whole lump of dough or whatever. And in this verse, it probably represents persistent unbelief. That's what the leaven is. Closing of the mind to what Jesus had clearly said and what Jesus has already clearly demonstrated. And the point is this, that just like a little yeast affects the entire batch of dough, a little hardening of the heart or closing of the mind to the evidence will affect all of your conclusions about Jesus and your ability to perceive the truth that Jesus reveals. Well, the disciples get it. Jesus warned them. Did they get it? Well, let's see, verse 16. They were discussing among themselves that they did not have any bread. Nope, they didn't get it. They missed the point entirely. They were discussing their breadless predicament. Now, discussing, I'm imagining they're discussing with something like this. Some of them were probably trying to draft a plan for how they could get bread, while others were assigning blame for, why they didn't have bread. Like, I told you to get the bread. Well, you had the basket, right? Whatever that was going on. They were discussing their breadless predicament. They completely missed the point of the metaphor that Jesus had given to them. Verse 17, aware of this, he said to them, why are you discussing the fact you have no bread? Don't you understand or comprehend? Do you have hardened hearts? Do you have eyes and not see? Do you have ears and not hear? And do you not remember? When I broke the 5 loaves for the 5,000, how many baskets full of leftovers did you collect? 12, they told him. And when I broke the 7 loaves for the 4,000, how many basketfuls of pieces did you collect? 7, they said. And he said to them, do you understand yet? Man, he just peppered them with questions. Why are you discussing the fact you have no bread? Don't you understand or comprehend? Don't you get it? Food is not a problem when I'm around. Right? Do you have hardened hearts? Do you have eyes and not see? Do you have ears and not hear? In other words, were the prophets Jeremiah and Ezekiel and Isaiah prophesying about you? Do you not remember? Do you not understand? Do you not understand who I am and the authority I have? Has it not clicked yet for you? Well, the answer was up to that moment, no, it had not clicked for them. They didn't seem to understand. Let's talk about us. You and I, as we read this story, there's an application for us. We want to beware of the permeating power of closing your mind to the evidence about Jesus. Beware of the permeating power of closing your mind to the evidence about Jesus. It doesn't just stay small, it spreads. Hardness of heart spreads. I said it already. Faith in God is vital for us, but it's not natural for the old nature. And so we have to be on the watch against the old nature. We have to beware of the old nature that's looking for a reason not to believe. We have to beware of that part of the old nature that is hardening the heart to the evidence about who Jesus is and his authority. There's always this old pressure that seeps in, and the hardness of heart can take over, where we're like, no, Jesus can't, or Jesus won't, or Jesus isn't, or Jesus, right? Or Jesus, it doesn't have anything to do with this, or my situation is different. Jesus is who he claims to be. And he's going to do everything that he promised that he will do. We want to beware, we want to be suspicious of anything that's hardening our heart to that reality and that truth. There's one more thing that kind of jumps out to me as I think about this set of stories we read today about feeding people with so little. I'm amazed at what Jesus did to break up the hardness of their hearts and to keep it from permanently dismantling their faith. If you think about all that he did, right? He does the miracle, feeding the 5,000, and then, but I bet he knew right then it didn't click for them. They had not really put it together. Their hearts were hard, and they had not learned the lesson of the loaves. They didn't get it. And so Jesus sends them out, and he lets them be there in the storm for a while. And then he came to them. And he got into the boat, and when he got into the boat, right, the storm ceases and everything, and they're astounded and stuff. But instead of being like, oh, yay, good, you guys see me, he rebuked them. He spoke to them a little bit strongly to get them to realize, hey, you shouldn't be surprised now. What was he doing in that moment? He's trying to break up the hardness of their hearts and keep it from permanently dismantling their faith. But it didn't end there, right? He repeated the miracle of multiplying food. And then he strongly warned them of the problem in them by pointing it out in the Pharisees and Herod so they could see it. Because it's always easier to see a problem in somebody else than to see the same thing in you. So he pointed it out. Look, there's leaven in the Pharisees. There's leaven in Herod, that persistent unbelief. Beware of that in your own life. He strongly warned them. And then when they still didn't get it, he grilled them with a series of questions to call them up short. He's protecting their faith. And he did it not for himself. He did it for their benefit. Sometimes I think maybe someone might think about all this and go, well, of course he protected their faith. I mean, because he's God and he wants people to believe in them. And he does want people to believe in him. But it's not, guys. God doesn't want us to believe in him like he needs us to believe in him. This is not like Santa in the movie Elf, where there's not enough people believing anymore, so the magic is no longer working. And so, they get together, a few people who start singing the Christmas carols, and as that happens, more people start to believe in Santa, and oh, wow, amazingly, the sleigh can work and the reindeer can fly again. God is not like that. God doesn't need believers. He can exist just fine without them. God does not need believers. Believers need God, and they know it. So when Jesus protected the faith of the disciples, he did it for their benefit. And in the end, I am very, very sure that they were very, very glad he did, because that was grace. And the same thing is true for me and for you. Jesus protects our faith for our benefit. And this is grace. So by way of application, I would encourage us to think about the times when God has proactively protected our faith. When has he done something to break up the hardness of your heart? When has God protected your faith by putting you through some circumstances, putting you in some situation that challenged you to remember and, oh yeah, get your faith back, get your trust in God back. Be amazed by God's grace. He's protected your faith. He revealed the truth about himself, but then he breaks up your hardened heart. Because being surprised that Jesus can do anything he wants to do, that's not good. But being amazed by grace, that's always good. So let's learn the lesson of the loaves, right? Let's learn the lesson of loaves. We don't want to jeopardize our faith in Jesus, and we don't want to have to be taught the same lesson twice. Let's learn the lesson of the loaves.